thank you for joining us for what I think will be an intimate but exciting conversation about the intersection of global health, entrepreneurship, and women, and gender, actually. I'm Lola Adedokin. I'm the Executive Director of the Aspen Global Innovators Group and the co-chair of the Aspen Forum on Women and Girls. Our focus is really on giving the visibility, amplification to leaders who we know are doing the work, who are designing innovations that capture the intersection and complexity that they're facing locally and hope to position them for replication and scale.
Hi everybody, I'm Richenda Van Leeuwen. I'm the Executive Director of the Aspen Network of Development Entrepreneurs, which is a 14-year-old initiative of the Aspen Institute focusing on helping support small business ecosystems to work and help small entrepreneurs to grow their businesses across the global south. And we run a network of business intermediaries, of incubators, accelerators, impact investors, and others that spans Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and much of Asia as well. And it's a pleasure to be with you all today.
I thought perhaps we should start just with a little bit of level setting. I know a lot of us are here because we're passionate about the issues and the intersect and have a lot of knowledge about the stats, but I thought let's start with a little bit of your expertise and share a little bit of background about where you're thinking in the space and what's informing your program design.
Yeah, so the United Nations Development Program came out with a report just this last week that was a bit shocking, particularly around where we are on gender equality. So I think the big idea for Aspen Ideas is actually that we really do believe in gender equality and that we act to make it happen. One of the stats was that even though women in the 50-plus countries where they were surveyed are now more highly educated than the men, they still have a wage gap of 39%. For me, the most shocking statistic, which is really a health statistic, a gender statistic, and it plays into some of the work that we're doing with women entrepreneurs, was that 25% of people, not men, people, so that includes women, think that it's okay for a man to be his wife. So we are seeing these entrenched attitudes, belief systems, and they flow over across into all of our work, your work on health, specifically gender-based violence, but also our work on entrepreneurship, which is that there are so many, whether they are explicit or implicit biases that we are addressing, and we're really trying to look at what is the evidence to show about what works to help women overcome many of the barriers to be able to succeed as entrepreneurs and grow their business, and especially right now, looking at it from the standpoint of in a world of climate change. Yes. How can we also be maximizing the leadership that women bring to the table as climate solutions providers as well?
Absolutely, and one of our biggest fears and concern is the pandemic impact. So 47 million more women have been placed into extreme poverty. So you can imagine even further away from the workforce, and that this untapped potential has such opportunity for strengthening systems. So we're, I think, together and with other colleagues in the room, trying to find ways to bring them back into the workforce, but also to think about the whole family approach. We also know that what takes women out of the workforce, especially in the global south, are unintended pregnancies or intended pregnancies. But once one pregnancy happens, that just totally has a multi-generational impact and an economic impact. So for us, in some spaces, people feel that it may be soft to want to center the voices and experiences of women and girls, but it's an economic requirement, expectation for our economies to thrive.
Absolutely, and in our work, we really focus on small businesses as being the engines of economic growth and development. 90% of small businesses, businesses around the world are actually small businesses. In developing countries, they contribute as much as 50% of employment. Many of them, though, remain informal, and that means that they don't contribute to the tax base. And informal businesses, while they may be able to provide opportunities for people to be entrepreneurs by necessity rather than choice, formalized businesses actually provide more in the way of decent employment opportunities. And so a lot of what we're doing is also working with our members to look at how can we help those businesses, those entrepreneurs, move from perhaps being a micro enterprise, a very small business, and actually go up that growth trajectory. And that's where there's a lot of evidence about, particularly for women. Of course, we work with men as well, but particularly for women, there has been this entrenched bias, so that even women entrepreneurs who go through acceleration programs to build their business do not come out as far ahead as men entrepreneurs through the same program. And we're still teasing out exactly why that is, but a lot of it has to do with that unconscious bias. Plus, women don't get the access to capital to grow their businesses in the same way. And again, we're sort of teasing it out. Is it because they have a more risk-averse approach to access to capital to grow their business? Or actually, are they more realistic about what their businesses need and don't overestimate the capital? So there's a lot of work that's going on across the sector, but we are seeing that women entrepreneurs are highly successful when they're given the opportunity. And not only are they providing for themselves, they're providing for their families and for those households. But they're also seeing, and this is a challenge that you just alluded to as well, that issues in the care economy are a big barrier as well, particularly women entrepreneurs who need childcare, who perhaps don't have an extended family who can help them with that. Interestingly, a perverse consequence of the pandemic was that a lot of business support programs went online. And so if that woman's household has access to electricity, and we still have 600 million people in sub-Saharan Africa who do not have access to electricity, but if they do, then some of the business development services were offered digitally. And so a woman who could not go and sit in a classroom for 2 weeks to take a business development training program was able to access some training services to help her in her own time if she has any to spare.
That's fantastic. And what you're naming is, you know, at a high level, the opportunity. But I would love for us to get into concrete success stories that we have to share. Can you talk, I'll share a few from my network that is global and domestic, and I'd love to hear from you about what are some of the innovations, some of the entrepreneurs who are really leading the way when it comes to centering gender equity and justice, but also when it comes to women leading their own businesses.
So one of the programs that we've been undertaking at Andy over the last couple of years with support from the government of Canada and the government of the Netherlands has been what we call the African Women's Climate Entrepreneurs Initiative. And through that one, we've actually been saying another idea, which again doesn't seem very innovative, but appears to be, which is that you can actually take climate action and support women as leaders together. Doesn't have to be separate, but you can really focus on supporting those women together. So we've been funding some intermediary organizations and some projects where we've been able to help support women entrepreneurs enhance their livelihood. So for example, one by the Kajo Foundation in Malawi, where women were already part of a fish processing supply chain, but they were not making as much from that as they could. Because they could not dry the fish to the best standards to get the highest price in the market. So through this program, we were able to bring in solar dryers to help the women improve the quality of their final product and then add value to it. So that was one example. And then another different type of example is in Rwanda, where we've been working with a group called the Westerwell Foundation, which is a business incubator. And wonderful woman named Sarah Rukundo, who came to, was part of the climate change conference, COP, with us in Abu Dhabi last year and shared the experience, in Sharm el-Sheikh last year, I'm getting confused, each year it changes, but she shared her experience about working and they, with 100 women, young women, green entrepreneurs who are setting up a whole wide array of different types of climate and green focused solutions for the Rwandan context, giving them business support that is tailored exactly to help them address some of these issues in a way that is gender responsive.
That's incredible. And this is when I think we both say we know enough to be dangerous around the sort of ESG agenda. So there are some clear guidelines in some of the sort of ESG, in some of the ESG framework, but I think the biggest box that we have yet to unpack is around the S, the social good. Can you talk a little bit about how you're connecting sort of the entrepreneurship work to the larger corporate conversation around social good and sort of connecting those dots?
Yeah, so we're doing some work with corporates. We've actually been doing work last year in Brazil, looking particularly at minority women in corporate supply chains. So we work with EY and others in Brazil, looking particularly there. Black women are very underserved. They have more challenges to be successful entrepreneurs. And there are mechanisms now where corporates are recognizing that they need to diversify their supply chains. So that's one example where we were able, through our members in Brazil, to bring women entrepreneurs to the attention of some of the corporates and help make those connections for them to be in that supply chain. And of course, not only as producers, but as potential customers as well. So, there's a win-win of recognizing that this is not only the entrepreneurs, but a supplier, but also a potential customer base as well.
That's phenomenal. One of the challenges I've seen, we've heard about a little bit of the maternal mortality crisis here in the US. And as shocking as it seems, the fact that mortality rates from mothers matches that of low-income countries. So when we recognize where there is a sort of a negative health outcome that matches that of developing countries, I'm always curious how we can bring communities together, how we can invest in women entrepreneurs who are addressing those issues to share and replicate and scale their interventions. So as an example, we are working with an entrepreneur here in the US, leading an organization called Health in Her Hue. It's a digital platform, a technical platform, where women of color can go to seek some of the best guidance around their own maternal health. And that's wonderful because here we have the benefit of pretty democratic digital access or technological access. In your perspective with the entrepreneurs that you're working with, can you talk a little bit about digital access and sort of what challenges and opportunities lie in increasing that opportunity for leaders?
Yeah, so one of the things that we saw during the pandemic was, in fact, digitalization by necessity rather than necessarily just because it was already part of their business plan. So as we all of us went digital because of COVID, so all of our member organizations and the entrepreneurs had to suddenly pivot to digital. And in some cases, as I mentioned, actually there were innovations. And I remember hearing one of our members in Nigeria had found a way to deliver business development service using a text-based approach for people in Nigeria who did not have smartphones. But yet they were able to modify text to make it available so they could actually do training for small entrepreneurs outside of the cities in Nigeria. So in some cases there was ability to adapt, but I'd say there's still a digital divide. It's ongoing, it's something we're still working through, both in terms of the intermediaries who are offering the services. Do they offer, is digital content delivery actually better than face-to-face? I think the jury is very much out on that one. I'm a face-to-face person. I think there's a lot of nuance, but there's also a lot of opportunity now. You can access content everywhere. Again, as I say, as long as you have access to a digital connection. Part of the work I've done before I came to Andy, really for the last 15 years, was helping to bring renewable energy solutions to parts of the developing world that didn't have access to electricity. And we really saw that, for example, a solar solution for a home or a clinic, but also a mini solar grid, which can be from an entrepreneur who's either a man or a woman, that both are great, actually helps with providing more access to power for productive use in that community, meaning that farmers and others actually can improve their livelihood which then has a positive spin-on effect. If they're able to provide for their families, they can afford better to feed their families, they can afford to access healthcare, and so on and so forth as well. So there's that digital side as well. I don't want to sort of say everything's great because we have digital. There really is still that digital divide. And even in countries as advanced as South Africa, you have the grid, but then my colleagues are experiencing 12 hours of load shedding right now, which has a massive effect, negative effect on business, and particularly disadvantaged smaller businesses who may not have the inverter or may not have the diesel generator to be able to pivot.
So lots to do. And what I think that's exciting out of the pandemic is a sort of a resurgence in the commitment to localization. So what does that mean? That means that a lot of aid agencies are trying to figure out how to transition from funding large, big entities that are typically in the Western world, who manage billions of dollars that drive global health and development, to actually redirecting those dollars to local organizations. And so there's such an opportunity now to invest in women entrepreneurs locally in meaningful ways. And we both come with the sort of global hats. So I would love to hear from you. How can we work better to inform some of the agendas for USAID, for example, who've made commitments around redirecting 50% of their investments to local organizations? What are the challenges and opportunities to really making real this localization agenda?
Yeah, for some of you who may not know, so USAID has made that commitment,
Yes.
which I think is a great commitment, but it's moving into it. It's been a transition, so I think slower than some would like, and then faster than others would like, who fear that perhaps there's a very complex development structure here in the United States. So I think there's a question of what does that mean, in terms of the future of some development organizations? And I think that the smart ones have already, some time ago, really focused on localization. And I will say, Aspen Institute also, we have many affiliates around the world, and including, in Latin America and under formation in sub-Saharan Africa. So we're also localizing. Yes. I think one of the things is that it's great to do. I think it's more than needed. It's well timed, but you also need those local organizations to have that support, right, so that it's not just. We work with a lot of local organizations that are great at what they do, but maybe their financial systems are less sophisticated than a big development provider might be out of DC. So that you need to also invest not only in providing a project grant for them, but in helping to support their capacity so that they have the most updated, whether it's a financial system. We need to really be holistic in that support that we're providing for those local organizations.
I 100% agree. The other pressure point from the global health community, and this is ongoing, is this emphasis on replication and scale. And I want to sort of speak about scale. When you look at your community and I look at ours, we're finding that we have to unpack the nuance of scale. Not everything is meant to be globally scaled or nationally scaled. Some of these solutions are actually responsive to a local challenge, a local health outbreak that is just specific to the area or the region within these leaders are living. Can you talk about some of the barriers or opportunities for replication and scale and how your entrepreneurs think about that and are positioned for that?
Yeah, so I think every country is different. Yeah. I think that's one of our, it sounds very obvious, but we work in many different economies. Mm-hmm. So we are faced with super high inflation in countries like Nigeria, some other countries on the continent then, that makes it very, very difficult for entrepreneurs to be able to predict what their needs are in terms of even of their capital raise. Are they raising money internationally, in which case if there's currency devaluation, that's a challenge. Are they raising money locally? Oftentimes we still find that local finance is not lending to local businesses because of perceptions of risk, particularly where there are business models where they're less familiar with the business profile and the return profile. So I would say that you can't just say, well, the 50, however many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and I say however many depending on which ones you count, that you can just provide an impact investment fund that is going to work in all of them. You really have to tailor it to the situation and to the context. But we are seeing a lot of capital being raised on the continent. So just on the gender side, there's a fantastic woman named Tokunbo Ishmael who raised one of the first, she runs Alethea Capital. She raised the first gender lens investing big fund. I forget how large it is. I think it's 100 million, something like that, on the continent, really focusing specifically on intentionality around gender analytics and helping women entrepreneurs get the access to the type of capital that they need at the right time in the right way to support their business. So we are seeing that local fundraising, but we also need a lot more of it, and it needs to be still complemented by the international capital and support as well.
I call myself a recovering philanthropist. I spent the last 14 years in philanthropy and have seen it evolve. This was US-based, but we did a little bit of investment in health system strengthening in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa. And I think there has been a bit of a moment of reflection for philanthropy to think about the roles that they can play. One, I think we both seen on the continent a desire to build out a philanthropic agenda. But I'm wondering from your perspective, what is the role that philanthropy can play that's different? We've talked in different settings about building the enabling ecosystem so that women entrepreneurs can thrive, and it's beyond just investing in their idea, as you've noted. Have you seen some best practices that you think we should share with the philanthropic community about how they can invest wisely and ways that support sustainability?
So I'll answer that in a slightly different way.
Okay.
So one of the things that we do at Andy is we have a research team, and they're terrific because we want to make sure that we're working from an evidence base. And we did a 5-year longitudinal study of acceleration to see, does acceleration actually work? It was called GALI. We published the results, and it's been very well utilized by many international finance corporations and others. One of the things that study showed was that in almost every market, with the exception of a few places in the Bay Area like Y Combinator, acceleration is actually not a private sector good. It has to be a public sector good because almost no accelerator can pay for itself. So there's a role there for smart philanthropy saying, yes, this is a public sector good. And we know that in many countries, governments are not going to be able, they're just too cash-strapped to be able to step in and provide that public sector finance. But we've recognized that, yes, acceleration does work. We can say that. I say that with confidence. And yet it still needs that philanthropic capital that can then help leverage the investment into the businesses once the entrepreneurs have gone through that acceleration program. So the answer is we still need philanthropy. And we have seen, at least in the small business sector, yes, there are good practices around what works, and particularly in good business development service provision. So we can say with some assurance now, what are some of the things that works? And in fact, one of the donors that works with us, our Gideas Foundation, has put a framework together called Scale, which is really showing some of the different best practices. And in fact, one of them is that you should be charging at least a little bit for your services so that the entrepreneurs have some skin in the game, but of course not charging them so much that it becomes a barrier. And there are several others like that as well that Andy is sharing with our network and really trying to sort of socialize across the whole sector. And I'm sure there are others from your own work as well.
I mean, absolutely. And what we're struggling with, however, is a lot of our leaders, especially women of color leaders, are struggling to get the attention of these accelerators, struggling to get in the rooms of these groups. So we're really trying to figure out what's the best way to position them for an audience that's ready to invest. I think part of that is telling the story right. telling the bigger picture, and leaning into the conversation around impact and the sort of double, triple bottom line impact that's possible. So that's what we're really focusing on in the coming years. And as we walk into our next kind of, for us, flagship moment, UNGA, that's coming in up in September, I'm curious. We have ideas of ways in which we can position and partner, but what are some of the key kind of messages that we need to impart on our development leaders who are not necessarily thinking about health? This is our world and our passion, and the intersection of gender. How can we better position this argument on platforms and stages like that?
Yeah, so UNGA is the UN General Assembly,
Yes.
if you weren't familiar with that one. And this year it's a particularly special year because it's at the midpoint review of the Sustainable Development Goals. And if you've been following this, you'll find that we are actually, as a world, we are behind on achieving many of these development goals. So I think one of them is our intentionality. What is our commitment really, or our redoubling our commitment to try and make progress. And particularly, as I say, from my perspective, it's really, first of all, I would say for the small business community, it's actually recognizing the value of small business solutions as an enabler for achieving many, if not all, of the SDGs. Private sector tends to be corporates. I have nothing against corporates. We have many corporates here, engaged at Aspen Ideas Festival. But we tend to underestimate the role and the value, even though we have, more than 200 million small and medium enterprises in developing countries. We've underestimated their solutions' value. So that would be one point I would say. The second, as I've mentioned, is we're in the urgency of now taking climate action. So please, please, please look at women as solutions providers, and let's equip them so that they can go out and just do this wonderful stuff. Not to exclude the men, but really to recognize and from a philanthropic perspective, try to not be so heavily siloed. There's a lot of work on gender, there's a lot of work on climate, but how much climate finance actually is focused on gender? It's very little. And I think that's where we need to lead the way with more of these sort of integrated, holistic solutions. And I just want to do one little vignette that is not a small business one, but I'm passionate, Lola knows I'm passionate about the intersection between climate solutions, renewable energy, gender, and health. I worked, 5 years ago, I broke my leg very badly and was in bed for 3 months. While I was recovering, one of the few things that I could do outside of work was help to raise money for a neonatal healthcare unit in Sierra Leone in Bo Hospital, which is the main hospital in Bo, which is the second city in Sierra Leone. That money was to put a solar system on the neonatal intensive care unit to support the baby warmers and the oxygen concentrators. We saw from the statistics in the hospital that the number of deaths of newborn babies went way down once they had access to that 24/7 oxygen concentrator. So not everything can be a private sector good solution. There's the public sector good solution. I work on the private sector now. We work on the small business. There's a role for both. We need both. We need both to be smart. We need both to be sustained and supported.
Absolutely, and maybe I'm biased, but I found in our partnership that's burgeoning, and just for folks who are really committed to that intersectionality, we've been able to work a lot faster together. I mean, one of the goals for the Sustainability Development Goals is Goal 17, around partnerships and collaboration. I think it's one that's unsung and under-focused on, and I'm hoping that with this sense of urgency that we're bringing, that I think a lot of our network is bringing, we can give more concrete examples about ways in which we can find opportunities for thinking about the triple bottom line, for bringing corporate, philanthropy, public sector together in meaningful ways. And I honestly think that when we look at the developing countries, low and middle income countries, all this deficit framework, positioning of countries that are in the global south, there are in fact, you've named so many, opportunities, innovations that are already in place, entrepreneurs who are more than ready for the limelight and for the financing needed to replicate and scale their programming. So I leave excited and for the opportunity and potential, recognizing that we are far behind in achieving the SDGs, to 2030. We know that there will be a convening again for the next set of goals for us all to ready ourselves for. So we are walking into possibility. I'll close on that front. But I'd love to turn to the audience for questions, input on this conversation. Thank you.
You were just talking about the intersection of both. Awesome. About the intersection between gender and climate change. And one thing that I've always been trying to figure out is when the Drawdown project came out, one of the things that it talked about is the most effective ways to remove carbon from the atmosphere was both girls' education and family planning. Those were in the top 10. They were better than renewable energies. And so how do we start to get the conversation to shift towards taking care of our girls around the world and educating them and working on family planning is actually, when you combine them, the most effective way to remove carbon from the atmosphere, and also comes with perhaps the best externality as opposed to just putting a solar panel on a roof. Now, not only are we removing carbon from the atmosphere, but we're also removing the barriers between gender, we're increasing economics, all this sort of stuff. How do we start to shift that conversation, and how do we get people to wrap their brains around it? Because with a solar panel, you're like, oh, it's happening right now, whereas with education and family planning, this is a 5, 10, 20-year sort of program.
Yeah, it's a great question. I will say that it's never just a solar panel on the roof. So I'm still in my career, and yet I was working in renewable energy I'm a recovering venture capitalist. But back in the mid-2000s, when it was still very much the economics were new, and it was still not kind of household, and we were nowhere where we are today. So that we've seen that shift just in about 18 years or so, and for many different reasons, some policy, a lot of private sector, a lot of volume, a lot of scaling. So I think the drumbeat is, I remember Isabel Coleman, who's now the deputy at USAID, many years ago wrote an article, I think it was either in Foreign Policy or Foreign Affairs, saying exactly that. The best investment you can do is to educate a girl. I think we just need to keep that drumbeat going, make sure that that's heard, each generation, that we continue to focus on that. I think the climate crisis is upon us, so I would say the good news is that we don't have to do either or. It's a both and approach. So yes, we still need the renewable energy solutions, and I used to work with Rocky Mountain Institute that has an office just down the Roaring Fork Valley in Basalt, and they do great work. We need many different types of solutions. But so thank you for raising it. Thank you for shining the light that yes, we still need very much that investment in girls' education. Mm-hmm.
Since the late 80s, we've spent a lot of our time in microfinance, both philanthropic, NGO. I've done a couple investment funds. I'm a little bit out of touch with the research. Well, what's the current thinking? I mean, when we started, the view was that microfinance would solve all the problems. It would create income, and people could then buy education, healthcare, nutrition. You're much more in touch with the current data. What's the current view in development world on microfinance? So
microfinance is a tool. It has a role to play. I think we all recognize that development is very complex. I think we've just heard that from Lola's conversation with me. So there's no one silver bullet solution. It's certainly been an immensely valuable tool, particularly for those micro-entrepreneurs who are starting a business out of necessity rather than out of choice. And it's become mainstream now. So we work at the Aspen Network of Development Entrepreneurs. We're working at the next level up, which is saying that you have a small business, but you are not able to grow it to its potential because of addressing or the need to address additional barriers, one of which may be access to, it could be equity, it could be debt capital, maybe it's the terms of the capital, because a lot of times we're hearing, even recently I was talking with entrepreneurs in Ghana that are required to put up 100% collateral in order to be able to get a loan. Now, if you have the 100% collateral, then you don't need the loan, essentially. So we're still focusing and facing these kinds of challenges across the financial system. So the answer is microfinance, absolutely, it plays a role. Other types of finance are needed, fully commercial capital, but also blended finance a lot. You can use the concessional capital, meaning a slightly lower cost capital, to help also crowd in other types of investment support so that the entrepreneur has access to the finance. And we've been saying really it takes an ecosystem to do this. Part of the reason I decided to join Andy at this stage in my career was that I saw a lot of the time that we were looking at like one entrepreneur. So I have met with individual entrepreneurs in, let's say, Sierra Leone working on solar solutions, or in other countries in West Africa and other parts of the world. I met a wonderful young woman who's building a solar company in Ecuador. And then I think, well, why is it that there's only one of them? Why aren't we looking at 100 women entrepreneurs or 1,000 women entrepreneurs? And it's because the ecosystem is not yet supporting them to succeed sufficiently. And that's why the kind of work that we're doing is still very much needed.
Absolutely.
Hi. First of all, I am a huge fan of the Rocky Mountain Institute's work, so really appreciate the work you've done with them. I'm an investor in actually a women-led startup called Luwa that develops sustainable sanitation systems operating in Madagascar and Philippines and South Africa. And so I'm curious what you're seeing in the sort of sanitation and clean water space, what seems most promising to you, and how are we going to get sort of broad access to sanitation and clean water throughout the Global South?
Well, first of all, I'll just turn it back to you and say thank you. Thank you for being an investor. Thank you for supporting those kinds of solutions, because they need it. And for those of you who aren't familiar, South Africa has actually been going through not only an energy crisis, but also a water crisis. And I remember Cape Town, was expected to run out of water. And so we need those kinds of solutions. We see that there's a lot of potential, and I can speak to some work that we've recently done, not in South Africa, but in Kenya and in India, where we work with the IKEA Foundation, looking at market sizing for small businesses in a range of different sectors, including renewable energy, including green buildings. In India, water and sanitation was actually the second largest opportunity after green buildings. And in Kenya, it was also seen as a nascent but massive opportunity. I think it was like $350 million opportunity for Kenya that needed more support, more investment. So I think we see that there is, at least in principle, the opportunity in that sector. However, we're also seeing that there is a lack of early stage capital to help some of those entrepreneurs be able to grow, which is why I say thank you again.
I've been seeing that last fall. So it's been, struggle to find it. I also think it's really important to note that Kenya and India are the hubs for these generic pharmaceutical manufacturing. So they have like extensive penetration of antibiotics and limited access to sanitation, which has just been like the perfect storm in terms of developing antibiotic-resistant bacteria, and which sooner or later is going to become like everyone's problem, but somehow not many people can see that.
Right. Any other reflections, comments? Great.
Hi, Rashinda. Glad to learn more about your work. I'm curious more about the private sector engagement. You made a comment in the context of incubators or acceleration of ideas and not being able to make that work there, or that it's really more, it needs to be more of a public good to make it work. Do you have examples of what the private sector is really doing that is of use? Is it too short-term focused? Like, do you have any kind of general sense of where the private sector is leaning in and where it's not, or Anything more you could do to elaborate on its role?
Yeah, so that's a broad question. So I'll try not to give too broader answer. No. It's a great question. So my point about acceleration was to say that private sector funding alone isn't getting us there. So there is still that need for some degree of subsidy in most accelerators, not every single one. As I mentioned, Y Combinator is one that they get the equity, they've got a business model, it works, but it's in the Bay Area, and there are several others like that, most of them here in the US. Private sector is very engaged. I'll give an example, in Guatemala right now, we are working with USAID under Vice President Harris's addressing the root causes of migration initiative. And there what we've been doing is actually, Andy has been the sort of like the neutral framework, helping to crowd in private sector investment to support funding that USAID has been giving, specifically for supporting small entrepreneurs trying to grow their businesses in historically disadvantaged areas. So in the highlands of Guatemala, particularly across Guatemala, but a lot with some of the indigenous communities. So there we've actually seen really good private sector support from companies like Cargill and Starbucks and PriceSmart, which is Guatemala's Walmart, and others coming in alongside some of the softer financing, which is really supporting the intermediaries to be able to work with those entrepreneurs to provide the kinds of technical assistance and support that they need. So we're seeing some good examples of private sector and public sector working hand in hand, and that's one. I'm heading to Guatemala in a few days, so I'll be seeing that in action later in July.
Thank you. Any final thoughts, words from the audience, and then I'll turn to our little conversation here. Well, with that, one, I want to thank you. I think Aspen provides such an incredible, rich platform to partner with leaders like you as we bridge entrepreneurship, public advocacy, visibility, and leadership, and this sort of centrality around gender equality and equity. So I'm really looking forward to continuing to work with you, with our other colleagues here in the room, as we really champion what's needed for economic development globally.
And I want to thank you, Lola, as well, for your leadership and really for being a champion for global health, because as we've seen and just, I think, touched upon even just a little bit in today's conversation, the health conversation permeates economic development, it permeates small business, it's not just limited to the health sector. It really does take an ecosystem for us to have a holistic approach to addressing many of these issues. So I want to thank you, and thank you all for joining us today as well.
Thank you.